Hi, everybody. I'm Sheila Black from AWP, and I'm here today to talk to Reginald Dwayne Betts about his new collection, Felon, which I'm holding up here.
Yeah.
And it's a really, really remarkable, very moving and beautiful book. So, Dwayne, I thought I'd ask you to start by just reading a poem for us from the book.
Sure, I think I could read one. Blood history. The things that abandon you get remembered different. As precise as the English language can be, with words like penultimate and perseverate, there is not an exact combination of sounds that describe only that leaving. Once, drinking and smoking with friends, a buddy asked if I longed for a father. Had he said wanted, I would have dismissed him in the way youngins dismiss it all. Shrug, sarcasm, a sharp jab to the stomach, laughter. But he said longing, and in a different place, I might have wept. Said once, my father lived with us and then he didn't. And it fucked me up so bad that I didn't think about us leaving until I held my first son in my arms. And only now speak on it. Once, a man who drank wild Irish rose and whiskey like water told me and some friends that there is no word for father where he comes from. Not like we know it. There, the word father is the same as the word for listen. The blunts we passed around let us abandon our tongues. Not that much though. But what if the old head knew something? And if you have no father, you can't hear straight. Years later, another friend wondered why I didn't name my own son after my father, as if he ain't know. Some things turn your life into a prayer. The gods will certainly answer. Blood history.
Wow, it's pretty great. Um, I was struck when I read this book. It took you a long time to come back to this subject. This was kind of your early history from 16 to 24 of being in prison. And you've published it at a time when there's an incredible national discussion around our justice system and what justice means and justice in relation to our history as a country. I'm curious, what so tell us something about the process of coming to writing this book, and also what you hope sort of people take from it when they think about the current questions about the justice system, our justice system.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though, because I think what you just said is like sort of our history as a country. But I think anytime I write something, I'm trying to wrangle the sort of twin challenge though. You know, it's like our history as a country, but then our history as individuals,
Yeah.
and and you know, family history, personal history, and so I think for me, I hope somebody picking it up, reading it, kind of comes away thinking about that. Like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the two things? And then in this particular moment, I think part of me just wants to recognize that this moment isn't that different from a lot of previous moments. You know, I was reading Claudia Rankine's "Please Don't Let Me Be Lonely" earlier this month, and it reminded me of Amadou Diallo
Oh
and
yeah.
Sean Bell. You know, and it's a way in which the moment will convince you that something is particularly new about the tragedies that we witness publicly, but um, maybe the ability to, in the past you had to rely on the news, so
Mm-hmm.
you see nightly news and you had to rely on them to replay the Rodney King beating. When now it's on Twitter, on Facebook, or something that you could control, and so it's a way in which like you could keep pushing play and you could keep pushing rewind. Whereas before you had to like get up to watch the news at that particular time, and the news was only showing it once a week or twice a week. You know, it's now it's like feel like it's on loop. But just because it's on loop doesn't mean it's different. You know, and also doesn't mean it's it actually also doesn't mean it's more egregious. You know, it just means that it's a thing that we reckon with more, maybe because of the circumstance and the situation of sight.
It's less redacted, um, in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely.
And I love what you said about the sort of individual. That was something that really struck me, and I have to say I really took in about the book and loved about the book, is that conflict between being an individual and being located in history, or the way history leads into being an individual. Like what's personal, what's political. A poet I know, Ilya Kaminsky, said to me once, we're the only country that makes that designation between this sort of what's a political poem, what's a personal poem. But I'm interested in one of the things that was interesting is, in some respects, there's a double consciousness. You mentioned W.E. Du Bois' veil at one point, and that idea of double consciousness of being Black in America, but also it seems to be a question you're holding open about humanity.
You know, what I'm really frustrated with, I think, when I'm thinking about everything I hate, is that it's just so much you aren't supposed to say. You know, you aren't supposed to say that it's the same group of lawyers that represent every family that has a loved one murdered by the police.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to, but that's not okay to me.
No.
And it makes me feel, and it makes me wonder how this guy feels, having represented so many families of dead Black children, of Black folks that have been murdered. Like, and it's other things that you aren't supposed to say. And it's interesting though, because when I wrote that poem, it says something like, this is not supposed to be the brick and mortar of poetry. And then I thought, you know, poetry isn't what matters though. So if you read the poem now, it says, this is not supposed to be the brick and mortar of America. And it was me, like, on revision, recognizing that, you know, I said something, and I was, the notion that like that it was frustrating because this is what poetry was about, was inadequate thought for the tragedy I was writing about. Mm-hmm. The real thing is that this shouldn't be the brick and mortar of poetry. But the point about the algorithm too, though, is that, like, as a society and as a country, we got a set way. You know, we got a few set ways of doing things, and because a lot of the institutions of power still rely on the set ways that they've done things for a minute, it becomes so much easier,
exactly,
to have another Tamir Rice, or like, let's say it's not easier to have another Tamir Rice. It's easier for when it happens to act like you need to justify it, beyond saying that, like, this was a profound tragedy, and at this point we need to figure out exactly what it means for somebody to be held accountable for this to happen. Like, we don't have to run around in circles and try to find why it was justified and try to imagine an AK-47 that was invisible but somehow still in the kid's hand, you know. So but that's what I was trying to get at with that poem.
Well, and I think one of the things that's interesting is you keep talking about history, personal history, collective history, and there's an idea in which maybe how a story is told, or how a word is used, or how a word is laid on something, like even the word felon. You talk in that poem about the one that where you actually say felon, incarcerated felon. Do you think that part of America's problem, and why we keep doing these things over and over again, is in a sense the veil of the stories we tell versus the way of making them
you know,
true?
I think we just keep, I don't know, I think we just keep telling them because we're human. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, it is what it is. You know, I think that we struggle to be better in this instance. Like, you know, the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, the arc, history, it's the moral arc of history bends towards justice.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that's true, but like, as people, you know, we create our own arcs, and I think that we bend towards repetition more than anything else, and we trying to figure out how to like escape out of that. But I mean, I was reading Absalom this morning, and you can't convince me that those aren't like these same themes that we're dealing with right now. Those aren't these same things that we're attempting to address. And so I you know, I want to feel heartened by the fact that we're still finding ways to strive for the sense of notion of justice that we have. Because it's so easy to feel bitter or feel otherwise, right? So I want to figure out, and then how to recognize the poems I write or the stories I tell as me trying to think through what it means to reconcile oneself with all of it, you
Mhm.
know. And maybe sometimes I think the poems are the thing that comes before being a better person.
I
You
like.
know, the grappling with all of the stuff that allows you to be better or to do better.
It seems to me that one of the things poems allow you to do, I mean, I read these poems twice in the last few days, the whole book. And one thing I really was struck by was I kept thinking,
I don't even think I read the book twice. No, I'm joking.
but I'm a sort of ADHD speed reader. So if any book I like, I have to read multiple times.
I be telling people this all the time. I shouldn't, right? Because it makes me feel like one is one of these things. Is like you can't really be a convict and a nerd, and that's what labels do. You know, they just call you a felon because then call you a felon, you don't really have to be anything else. If I show a picture of you with a mugshot, then the mugshot classifies you in a way that doesn't need any further explanation. In the same way that people would take these photos and they are like framed in a certain way that feels like a preppy picture, and it's like the classic. You on a crew team photo. And so when when that's the photo that people see, they're like, oh, he's this person, right? Or she's this person. But anyway, the last book, but life always subverts that. And this is what literature does, right? Literature opens you up to a world where people are far more complex
Exactly.
than the cliches and the stereotypes that we use to figure people out. But anyway, related to this thing that you just said is it's the first internet search I did, right? Was for speed reading. That was the first thing, was to figure out how to speed read faster. And then the last book I read, one of the last books I checked out from the library before I went to prison, was Evelyn Wood's
Oh,
Guide to Speed Reading.
mhm.
And her guide didn't work at all, or maybe it worked. I don't know, but I don't know. I read fast. I don't think her guide worked though. All of it is sort of based on being able to still your mind enough to recognize when what 2 or 3 words mean at the same time, and you
Mhm.
don't have to say them aloud in your head. I don't know if that stuff works, but anyway, I think it's fascinating to think about the ways in which our love and bond for literature not only um, allows us to interact with the world in a certain way, but also makes us believe that it's important to interact with books in a certain way. And the act of reading a book over and over again, I think is part of that, or like writing in a book or carrying books around with you so that they're always close by. I think all of it is a part of how we interact with the world.
I think it's another way we live vicariously too. It's kind of how we enter other worlds, live other lives. I like that idea of opening yourself to the full complexity, because I think that I kept thinking about negative capability, which was like that Keats idea.
Yeah.
What makes a great artist or something? And he said it's the ability to rest in doubt, without any irritable striving after fact or reason. I feel like in some ways with these poems, you're kind of to some degree trying to do that with the history we've been given, but that by holding all those things right next to each other, you are kind of making us think about it in very different ways. I wanted to talk a little bit, just because this AWP audience is an audience of teachers and students
Yeah.
of writing. So why poetry? Let's start with that. What drives? What do you think? Why poems?
Yeah, I mean, I think a poem contains a whole world in a way, in a brief amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody can say, let me hear something. And you say, name a song that tells a man what to expect after prison, explains Occam's razor, is still a suspect after prison.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a poem, and it's a couplet and it's part of a guzzle, but you could get somebody that you could say, something beautiful about being able to carry those words in your head and be able to communicate so much in a short span of time. Think about when I read Blood History, and it's like I know it by heart. Anybody want me to do something, I could do that. And you could switch it up, and you could switch it up emotionally, you know. Yeah, so I think that's one way for why a poem. But then also maybe a like more concrete way. So I was in prison when I was 16, and I was in a hole, and somebody slid Dudley Randall's The Black Poets under my cell door in a place that was starving for literature, in a place that I wouldn't have expected to find literature. Definitely not Black literature, definitely not like Black poets. And I say that because, you know, even though that book was published in the 60s, probably was worth, like, when you bought it in the CD, you buy it for $1 or something. It was just scarce. You know, it's not something that would have existed in prison much at all. And slide it under my door, and I'm 17, 18 years old. And I'm like, wait, Etheridge Knight, Lucille Clifton, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni, Robert Hayden. It's like a whole world that reveals itself to me. And I decided to be a poet at that moment. And part of it was, you know, Etheridge Knight was writing about juveniles being in prison.
Yeah.
In the 60s and 70s for Freckle-Faced Gerald. And I'm reading this thing and wait a minute. I thought that I was unique. You know, I thought that my whole cohort, my guys, all of us in the early to mid 90s, we were the first people to go to prison as juveniles. And then I learned different in a poem. And that's taught me that poem could convey history, could convey music, could convey narrative. And I just thought the poem was everything I wanted to do as a communicator, you know. So it's kind of humbling though to think that a book could do so much, you know, and kind of mean so much. I got my I need to change my battery. I'm a poet. I'm not
I thought it was
I'm
my
not a
battery. That makes me
yeah.
feel. I was like, here I am, an employee of AWP, and I mess up by not changing my smoke alarm battery.
You know, the only reason I say this is because people watching this, and I want to convey that I am actually a decent human being, because I've been watching this, and I've been watching you look up, and I was like, I think she thinks that my smoke alarm is her smoke alarm. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just let it rock like that, because maybe the audience will hear this thing going off. Like I tell you, I'm a poet, which means I try to bend towards honesty, but also this is really high, and the only way to get this is with a ladder. And he did this whole thing about negative capability, but he didn't write anything about ladders. And
No.
so I got a house, and I got him on the shelf, and I got all of these poets on the shelf. The first thing that mattered to me in the house was the bookshelf, right? But it was not the ladder. And so I've been trying to figure out how to get rid of this noise for like 3 weeks, and I've just decided that, you know what it is? It is an I am. This is actually not an I am.
But
It's actually it's a line of blank verse. So if you measured it out, it's actually 5 I ams. It's like boom, 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 boom. So
so it's helping you write. You're taking the environment. You're using your broken smoke alarm. Well, I'm so reassured. I'm the kind of person who forgets to change the batteries. That's why I was so sure it's mine, because I can go around for weeks with things kind of broken that way, which is terrible. But speaking of the poem, that was a really beautiful description. I've noticed when you read, I noticed one thing poetic language often does for me, and I felt this in your book many times, is it's almost like you could feel the weight of the words and you start to slow down. And maybe that's where you kind of pass into another world. Some of the poems I was really eager to talk about were the redaction poems in here. And I want to hold one up for our audience. Well, one thing those poems made me did was look up all the amendments. I you know, like most big Americans, I pretty much know what they are, but I actually went and read them again, like the 14th, the 4th Amendment.
Yeah.
Because in certain ways, you're a lawyer as well. So in certain ways, no, you're a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer, yeah. So
it was interesting that you took this, but there were a lot of things about them that were interesting. They kind of punctuate the book. They have this, I thought it was a really novel way of using the idea of redaction. I grew up, my dad was in the State Department, so he was always bringing redacted documents home.
Yeah.
And usually they were to conceal the information they don't want you to know, right? Like, you know, it's all redacted so you don't get it. But here, the actual poems, when you read them with everything blanked out, are very plainly testimonial. Like you come away going, aha, they felt like testaments to me. So I was just interested in your whole process of of these poems, what you were, I'm just telling you my opinion as a reader there. You could say, no, that's not it. But
No, that's exact. I mean, it was a setup. If somebody watched this who had heard me speak before, they'd be like, yeah, Dwayne asked Sheila to say those things, because that's exactly how I describe it. I sort of compare it to, typically the idea of redaction is to conceal. And the thing is, legal text in general conceals so much, even when nothing's redacted. It's just their very language that's not a medium for the people. And you got this legal document called a complaint that is a way in which citizens, if it's a class action lawsuit, can make a complaint about how their rights are being violated, even if they're saying their rights are being violated by the government, right? So I thought, man, this is amazing. And these people are saying you can't lock us up because we're poor. We can't be held because we can't pay court costs or because we can't pay traffic tickets. And yet it was written in a document that I knew a lot of people wouldn't be able to understand. It's 70 pages, it's dense, and it also doesn't exist in the public space. And my book of poetry has been printed and held by more people than who have held those legal documents.
Right.
And then I thought it was something amazing and telling and kind of wonderful that it was called a complaint as a legal document. And there's also a poetic form called a complaint. And I thought, what would it mean if I turned this language into poetry? But I did it not by adding my own words, but by redacting what was superfluous. And so I went through, the 70-page complaint, 80-page complaint, and I just redacted everything I felt like was superfluous. And it was for me, a process of revelation, because it was me learning all of what mattered and being able to go back and double down and reject all that didn't matter and that doesn't matter.
That's amazing. And even the physical act of crossing out is sort of a work, sort of like it almost creates a physical model for the work of thinking. You know what I mean? Like you see this, it's got this thingness. And I was also very moved by those poems, because I don't know what it is about sometimes found pieces of language that come from somewhere, even though they're simple words, like the defendant in the policy, desperate to get back. They all seem to they carry that atmosphere of the document they came from. It was very interesting. I also noticed you used the redact font.
Yeah. Because me and Titus, we did a series of prints called, and it ended up culminating in an exhibit called The Redaction. And so the series of prints is about 50 in a set, and it's a series of etchings. So it's complicated in a way. We printed it all on black paper, and usually when you print, you want to touch the paper as little as possible. But we wanted to have a process that also simulated how complex all of this is. And so he did these beautiful portraits of people that were sort of based on the mugshot, but he double dropped the images. And so he overlaid one person's face with another person's face. And the only thing that's really distinct, the eyes, if you look at the eyes, then you begin to see the distinction. And what we're trying to push is that, the mugshot is a distancing tool. By dropping both faces on at the same time, you got to get closer to see who you're looking at. And then with the redactions, we silk screen the text, and then we silk screen the redacted lines on top of it. So again, you had one piece of paper with 4 passes, and it opened at MoMA. Like last year, we opened the exhibit at MoMA. We haven't run any in New Haven now, so if you're in New Haven, yeah, you can check it out at Next Haven, which is a cultural institution that Titus put together, and it's great because it's in an old factory, like an old glass factory, an old ice cream making factory. But a lot of times, we live in these communities where the factories have disappeared, and those the Winchester gun factory is right down the street from here, and it's just a bunch of busted out windows, and it's like, how do you do something more with that property? And so what he did was he created a cultural institution that brings, really gifted and talented artists in New Haven to be fellows and to be residents of the city. But so you could, if you come through, you could see it, and you could see it virtually as well at the Next Haven website, Next Haven without any verbs in it. So NXTHVN. But anyway, to the point though, we wanted to also create a font with this project. We didn't want to have a project, and we wanted everything to be intentional. From the paper that we used, I made some paper out of, had some paper made from the clothing of men that I know who have been doing 20, 30, 40 years in prison. And, fascinatingly, part of this is that when this started, we started working on this, started getting their clothes. I started making paper out of their clothes. I got 3 of these guys out of prison. And so, on parole and in different ways. And so part of the fascinating process is we always figuring out how to make art and life, how to make it be less distance between art and life. And not to say that, like, I'm writing poems that are one-to-one sort of translation of the life I'm living, but to say the art is trying to do something different. It's trying to push us closer towards wherever we imagine that art to be taking us. And for me, I imagine it to be taking me to like some place that's better than justice. Or like my very first poem was about a father of 2 kids, and he was first poem I got published after Bert Miller published it for Poet Laureate, but it was about a father who
was the first place I was ever published too.
Oh yeah, see, and I'm telling you, people gonna be like, you know what, Sheila and Dwayne making all of this up. They probably related. They could be like, Sheila might be Dwayne's cousin or something, and that's why they know so much about each other.
But it was a great journal that launched a lot of people.
And that was, that poem I published, that was about a father and father trying to go back to the old neighborhood to see what the light that was in his eyes as children that they say was gone from his eyes. And I think all of my work, or all of these poems I'm writing, is about chasing that light. And I think that you can have that light even when you have to deal with hard stuff. But I think, my work is about chasing that light.
I agree. I noticed, and I think that, but it's also, it's truth, beauty too, because I noticed your dedication, which was to your family. You said, for the many moments I cherish and every regret for all of it. And I feel like there's a way in which poets are always trying to think about, how do you live in the moment fully? And in a sense, that's that moment where the past is all there too. The poems I'd love you to talk about in that regard is Parking Lot 2, TOO, Parking Lot 2. That's a pretty remarkable poem. In fact, if you want to read it, I'd be thrilled, but you don't have to. It's a remarkable poem and a book of remarkable poems.
Let me see if I can find it. I don't know what page it's on.
I know I'm not being a sycophant. I really like this book. It's fantastic. It moved me.
I don't doubt you. It's an amazing book. I think people listening and watching this, they should read 5. They should get 5 copies.
They should all get 5 copies and share that. Well, I think this book especially speaks to a lot of things about, you said this moment's not that different, but we have this palimpsest of things laid on how we read our history, how we understand it. And it feels like we're really caught in that loop unless we begin to, what you said about the algorithm earlier, unless we really find ways to maybe be more truthful or maybe short-circuit. But I would love you to read that poem and talk about it a tiny bit.
Yeah, I'm gonna read. I'm gonna see how I can read this.
Parking Lot 2. A confession began when I walked out of that parking lot. A confession began when I walked black out of that parking lot. A confession began when I, without combing my hair, dressed for a day that will find me walking out of that parking lot. There's so much to be said of a black man with unkempt hair. He meets the description of the suspect. Suspect is running. I ran away from things far less frightening than the police. A confession began when I rolled myself in black. A confession began when I walked out of that parking lot wearing a black hoodie. Things get exponentially worse when a hoodie is pulled over my unkempt hair. A confession began when I walked out of that parking lot black. A confession began when I walked out of that parking lot a Negro. A confession begins when that walked into the parking lot. A confession begins when that, and the pistol he carries like a dick, walked into that parking lot. A confession begins when everything you see him doing is seen as sex. A confession begins when that walked into a parking lot and drove away with everything belonging to that white man. A confession begins when my mother laid up with a man the complexion of that daddy. A confession begins when my mother births a child in a city close enough to make me and that almost related. A confession begins when the police perceive us as one. We must be one. He could not have walked in and driven out, and I walked in and walked out on the same night, and whatever gaps in the story and slight differences in the features of our faces was just more evidence that all will lie. A confession begins even if I didn't have the fucking car. A confession begins even if I can't drive. My confession began with a woman stitching stars and stripes into a flag.
Wow. Well, I like so much the way that the poem really takes us through this very immediate moment and then out into history in a way that's kind of remarkable. And I think it speaks to that project where you said putting one face over the other, the need to kind of come in and get closer. I guess I wanted you to talk about a little bit more about that history against this idea of the moving toward the light. Mitchell S. Jackson on the back of this book said something I thought was great. He said, "The collection is also a moving exploration of love, romantic and familial, and how one nurtures that love against odds that at times seem impossible." I noticed in a lot of, you have a lot of poems about fathers and sons. It's also quite a feminist book. You have that several poems where you really speak up for women. So you want to talk a little about those things?
That kind of makes me feel good that you said that. I think, I think I'm trying to be complicated a little bit. I think, or at least I'm trying to like be honest, right? And so one of the versions of this is every poet believes that somehow the book names them.
Mm-hmm.
That makes every poet, but I think it's a fear that as a poet, in a way that's not true for the fiction writer, right?
Yeah.
And in a way that's not true for the director, for the person who writes the screenplay. You know, you don't think that if you directed Menace to Society that people think you carjack folks. But it's a way in which the poet feels deeply connected to the poems that he writes or she writes. So they write and they imagine that connection is also going to be felt by the audience. But the way the audience will feel that connection is to say that this thing is you.
Exactly. Yeah.
But then what that means, though, is the people who write about like domestic violence, the people who write about sexual assault, it's always the voices of those who have experienced it, right? And it's always in the voice of those who have experienced it, but it's not enough in the voice of like the people that's doing this kind of shit. And so I was trying to figure out a way to address it. And if I'm going to write a poem like, a poem about my man being sentenced to prison for a crime he didn't commit, if I'm going to write a poem like Essay on Reentry, that's like really accounting for what it feels like to have to tell your child you've been to prison. And if I'm going to write that and know that borrows so much from my narrative, I wanted to say something else and to say something that was harder and to say something that was like acknowledging that this is a whole world that we're talking about, and the world isn't just, F the police.
Mm-hmm.
The world is also a world in which Black men harm each other, and a world in which Black men harm women, and just harm people that they love, or people that they don't know, and the poems are me trying to get at that. And even the poem I just read is really like every time somebody gets falsely accused, right, of a crime, and every time somebody gets exonerated because they didn't commit the crime, two things have happened. A tragedy and a travesty against justice has happened because somebody spent time in prison for something they didn't do. But also somebody that did the thing didn't get punished. And whatever we imagine punished should be in a just world, right? And so it's like in that one, I got Parking Lot, and I think it's kind of sympathetic. And it's like, you didn't know that this was going to happen, and you didn't know your whole life was going to be changed by doing this thing. But the flip side of that is, a lot of people's lives get changed by the crimes that one person commits and others get accused of. And so all of the work, I think, is not doing the same thing, but it's trying to grapple with questions in an honest way. And for me, anyway, it's a corrective, because in my previous books, I don't think that anybody would assert that I was, you know, and I'm not saying I'm a feminist, but I'm not saying that I am saying that I aspire to being far more thoughtful, and to have women in my life who be like, actually, though, you do have a lot of feminist ways, and I consider that an aspiration, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm saying is, in my previous books, I was like ignoring women, or women only showed up in one very, unfortunate way, as like types, as cliches, as tropes, as people who suffered only in one way. In these poems, I try to give folks agency, and Night, it's like, I swear I awaken and she stares at me. She is saying brown liquor owns you. Those cells own you, and there's no room for me unless I call the police upon a state, upon my pistol, and finally set you free. And it's me trying to give agency to this woman that is in this relationship that's clearly abusive, and it's like, yo, you fucked up, and you are drinking too much, and this is a real thing. Like mass incarceration can be very real, and at the same time, you need to get your shit together. And I think, like, far too often, maybe my work, but the rhetoric of some of these discussions, I think, flatten that out. And so I wanted to write some stuff that did more to not flatten that out,
And I think you did, and that's the hard thing of poetry. I was really interested in what you said about the eye, because I think one thing that's really interesting about the book is it feels like you don't try too hard to locate the eye. Like, I didn't read all these poems as autobiographical, which I think is good. I mean,
yeah.
One of the poets have to own their eye, but the eye doesn't have to be them. And I think that was a good point, because if it's going to be this, and it can't be this ideal eye either, as much as we'd like it to be,
Right. And writing a poem, that's all you could, honestly, like writing them. It's so funny though. I mean, I've written poems and then people come up to me. I wrote a poem where I had a review of a book where they said, in this book, Reginald Dwayne Betts admits to selling crack to pregnant women. And I was like, I never did that. I find that quite odious. Like, who the fuck sells crack to pregnant women? Like, you have choices to make in life, and that's the choice. Like, I don't think that's cool. I just wouldn't have done that. And at first I was really like resentful that the person said that to me, right? But then I was like, oh, said it about me in a newspaper magazine that my mother could have read, right? And then I thought, one of the things about owning an eye is recognizing that you can't be ashamed. You can't be making decisions about the eyes that you want to be in a book because you're thinking about how people will respond to you as a person if it's read that way. So, and it's interesting though, because I was thinking about I was watching Evan Boland lecture at Bread Loaf, right?
Yeah.
And it was about Irish poets, and it was about these Irish poets that were like poets of the people and who often were looked at with disdain. But she started the lecture by talking about an essay Chinua Achebe wrote about Conrad and the Heart of Darkness. And he was saying Conrad was racist. But part of what he was saying was that as a writer, you have a responsibility not to create characters and not to create situations and tropes that exist just to dehumanize others or demean others. And that's not to say that you aren't supposed to write a happy-go-lucky, joy is the world kind of book. But it's to say that, like, you have to have nuance. You have to flesh things out. You have to create a world in which it offers just as much light and insight that exists in the actual world. And he was talking about how it feels like Conrad went out of his way to paint Africa as a backwards place. Well, if I write an eye that's an abuser, if I write an eye that assaulted somebody, part of the challenge becomes like, I got homeboys in prison for like killing people, right? And you talk to their family, and all their family want them to be free. I want them to be free, right? You got people that's in prison for all kinds of wild shit, and they get all kinds of support. And people who love them is like, but this person is also this other thing. And one of the challenges of the poem is to know that like the person is this other thing as well.
Yeah.
The situation is this other thing as well. And
maybe it's for all of us to know something like that about ourselves, which is hard because it seems that, you know, these are all the debates going on. You have to have some kind of justice in the world, obviously. You have to have a justice system. We have a very, I would say, corrupted justice system. Doesn't have a restorative function per se.
But I don't even think it needs to, though. I mean, I don't even think it needs to. I think that we just have to ask serious questions, right? We just need a metric to say like 20 years is how much time you get, no matter what you do. And then let's argue about it. You say, well, wait a minute, this person killed 4 people. He only does 20 years? I mean, I would do 20 years for killing 4 people. You know, I mean, I wouldn't kill 4 people, but I'm just saying 20 years.
Well, I mean,
but when we say, but I guess my point is just like when we say something wrong with our justice system, we complicate it out to the fact that we never actually deal with the real problem. And the thing that's complicated about our justice system is we have created a menu of punishments for crimes. And if many of those punishments for those crimes are unjust, then what are the punishments that would be just? And it is like simply being willing to grapple with that, being willing to say, you know, this, I don't know. And justice doesn't always look like, it might look restorative for the person that was harmed. It should look restorative for the person that was harmed, but it doesn't necessarily look rehabilitative. No. Like somebody who likes to steal, it's like, yo, I'm a thief. This is what I do. I'm a thief. Ocean's 11 and Bahamas, they wasn't trying to be rehabilitated. I watched Ocean's 11, 12, 13. I even watched like the Ocean 7. Nobody on that show was trying to be rehabilitated. It wasn't. They were thieves. You know, and it's like, so what should happen in a world in which people are like, you know what, let's just steal stuff. I'm like, for those folks, I still don't think they spend forever in prison. But I don't know, you know, it's like you answer that question. And I think that like when that question is on the table, it becomes, the conversation becomes more fruitful. You know, it's like, okay, well now we could get somewhere. We could actually say, you know, and Danny, he did his 5 years. He was like, it's cool. I do 3. I get out in 3, and then I'm gonna go steal again because I'm a thief. He was like, come on, who? He's like, I'm a thief. So I don't know. And I think that it was a way in which we exoticize the commission of crimes because we imagine that there is no world in which that exists. Like this dude just beats his wife. That's what he does. And so I don't think he should die in prison, but he can't keep beating his wife. So then what do we do when we have made that decision? And then we made a decision and then he found her and beat her again. Okay, so now what do we do? It's a great book, Women Talking. And I think it's one of the greatest, the really good novels one of the best novels of the past decade that actually Miriam Towles.
Okay, I'm gonna look it up. Let me ask you one more question because I'm getting the message that I wanted to ask about your project, actually, the Million Book Project, because I think that it's a really important project for you to tell our audience about. And I think,
oh yeah, thank you. You know, I'm supposed to tell people about this all the time. So the Million Book Project is
well, yeah, and how you started it and what you're going to try to do. Yeah. This is very exciting.
I told the story earlier about, you know, how I became a poet, and it's rare. You know, you won't have much contemporary poetry in prison. Mm-hmm. You won't have my book in prison. My book is running for $27 hardback. So
yeah,
a lot of states don't allow hardback books in. And then to the degree that people can buy them and order them, if you work for what I worked for when I was in prison, $27 is 120 hours. So it's priced out. I wanted to create a project that said that literature is important and that made that a part of the iconography of prison. I wanted to think about what would it mean to put so many books in prisons and prison cells that the cells and the structures themselves had to collapse. I wanted to think about the books as a dignifying tool and a dignity affirming tool for people incarcerated and for the guards. And so I conceived of like, we put 2 million people in prison. What if we put 1 million books in prison? And what if we put a curated collection, freedom libraries, 500 books, and we put them in prisons all across the country and in Puerto Rico. Wow. And the idea is that, you know, these collections, I mean, bookshelves are idiosyncratic, you know, like this is my bookshelf, right?
Yes.
Kind of idiosyncratic, you know, it's like
I love that about them. Whenever I can show you my They're all over the place. But here's one. Let's see. Idiosyncratic, the book.
Yeah.
And yeah, my house is full of books. It's a bit ridiculous. But you're right. The idiosyncraticness is some of the great joy of reading.
And also, though, and part of that, though, is like people connect and bond with books and they do it over a generation. But imagine, I mean, I did 10 years in prison and I was never intimate with a bookshelf. You know, it was never one that was in close proximity to me. And I got introduced to definitely to Baldwin from a friend's bookshelf.
Yeah.
And so I think about what does it mean to do time in prison and not have that opportunity. And every prison doesn't have a library. And even when it does, the library is one space that can only serve so many people at a time. I would say, so anyway, I developed these and I put them in, and there's a bunch of things around them, you know, a bunch of kind of projects around it. For instance, it's cost effective really for us to print books that's in the public domain. So we're going to print, so we're creating a freedom press. And
wow.
But we're going to reprint Moby Dick, but then we're going to get a contemporary writer to write an introduction to Moby Dick. Like, what would you say about Moby Dick to somebody who's never heard of it, who's never heard of the book before? You know, not like what would you say about Moby Dick because like, Penguin is doing a new edition and you got honored to be able to write this. Like, no, what would you say when you're talking to somebody about something that you love and you're trying to convey that love to them, and not as an academic exercise? Redoing Shakespeare, some of Shakespeare work. And it's like, what would one of these guys that's done Shakespeare in prison, what would they say about Hamlet? Let this dude write this introduction to Hamlet. You think about like the Count of Monte Cristo, you think about Don Quixote, Frederick Douglass, you think about, and that's just be a subset, but it'll be a beautiful subset though, because it'll be a subset that we could like sort of curate and make a part of this thing. And also it's like creates a feedback loop between contemporary writers and not just their work, but contemporary writers in a continuum of work. And then there's a lot of other aspects of the project, including the survey, which I think we'll make available to people who are watching, because part of the curation process includes like a couple of things that we think are really cool. One is doing a survey. And so you just answer the survey, but it's cool to be like, what book did you read that you felt you needed to read again?
Oh, yeah.
That live with us, but that you don't like sit down and actually think about, you know, what book made you see things in this world differently? Especially when we live at a time where like, you know, so much.
Yeah. So
that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is we created these things called book circles. And the book circle is that I am so tired of Zoom. I am so tired of like being here and not being able to be around my friends. But also like this made me enjoy the conversations that I really am having, not for work. And so we created these book circles to be like, why don't you talk about what you love? And I come from like the people to book. And so we love books. And like, what does it mean to sit down with 4 people on a Zoom and a little happy hour, a little drink or something? No, not coffee, water, whatever, tea. But to say, you know what? When I read, like I've read Lesson Before Dying, I loved it. One of my favorite books ever. Read it cover to cover, remember it to this day. And now, 20 years later, I still love it, but it raises real questions. Right. This child was innocent of murder and was going to be executed. And the author was able to write this book and be lauded for the book. And nobody was like, wait a minute, how does this kid get executed?
Right.
The death penalty is okay. It's been ruled constitutional in this world and nobody's challenging it. And also they execute children and those things have all changed. It's a lot. The death penalty has waned in states all across the country, although the federal death penalty has come back because we made certain electoral decisions. But the death penalty is waned and you can't get executed as a juvenile. And so even that book makes me think about the shifts in the world. So we setting up book circles, which anybody can participate in. And it allows us to do 2 things. It allows us to like collect the anecdotes and the stories about the books that people love and to spread that. And to spread that is like, joy, really. And it allows folks to intimately connect with each other about the books they love. And then the final piece is I'm doing a series of interviews called Your Life in Books with people that I just admire and respect.
I love that.
And that's just to talk about people and their reading habits and their life in books and how their reading habits have changed. I'm 40, I'll be 40 in November, but my reading habits have changed from like 14, 15, reading Evelyn Woods to like accepting the fact that I can only read 2,500 books during my life. So I'm not going to read Hunger Games. It's like, I don't care. I'm also not reading Harry Potter. I don't care. I'm not going to read it. I haven't read all of Victor Hugo. You're not going to convince me.
Reading binges from time to time. I feel the same way. But you know, that the thing you said that really blew my mind was that idea of joy. Because I've always had this idea somewhere in there that if we're really going to have social change to a better world, there has to be the inclusion of something about people's joy. Like, how do they experience joy? What is joy? How do you grow your joy, whether in your family or your life? And we as I feel like we don't have enough rituals, habits, structures for that. So that book's whole idea of your reading life, because reading life, not like what you had to read or what you should read, but just your reading life is it's about pleasure in a lot of ways and joy.
Well, also strangely for reading to be such an isolating thing in terms of like, it's a thing that you do alone. And
Right.
You do it alone with difficult books, right? Well, you do it alone with books that you get great joy out of and the pages fly out of your hands, right? But it's also something that connects you to people because you get connected by the book that you read because this person recommended it to you. I still remember the person that recommended Tolkien to me.
Yeah.
I got a picture of him and his two daughters and his girl, you know. Yeah, I mean, and I remember this guy and I ain't talked to him in 15, 16 years.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
So I think that's part of it too. You know, it's the reading life, and talking about the reading life makes you remember not just what you read, but makes you really remember how what you read opened up a different kind of world and a different kind of space for you. So.
It's also in some ways the democratization of what education can be, that kind of pure education, like hard that you never really get the fun part of education until you're like in graduate school or something, you know, where it's just people talking.
If then, you know what I mean? If then.
If then.
Yeah, I mean, I read a letter. I'm using a letter for this that a guy wrote. You know, he was 65 and he was near death, and he wrote it to his granddaughter who was only 14 months. And he was like, you know, most of your education is not going to happen in the classroom. No. Most of your education is going to happen in your reading life. Like most of the things you know that matter to you will not happen in the classroom. And maybe the tools you get to really figure out what's worth knowing will happen in the classroom, but
maybe not. I mean, I feel like the reading I've done in my life has been the most important thing of shaping who I am. And
yeah, definitely. I think I became a discerning reader before I went to college, you know. So, yeah, but for a lot of people, you know, if you go to college at 17, 18, I think for a lot of folks, you begin to learn those skills of being a discerning reader in college. But like for me, I mean, I was reading, you know, man, I remember reading, like, again, a lesson before. I remember reading Stolen Legacy. I remember reading, and it was a hodgepodge of books, like stuff like Stolen Legacy, which was kind of fringy, to, you know, stuff like Achibe's Things Fall Apart, you know, to Evelyn Wood's book, to like all of Walter Mosley. And that's as a teenager. And I went to prison. So, yeah, you know, I actually fundamentally agree with you. And that's what this project is saying. But it's saying that for you to be able to do that and have that experience, something essential to that is books. And have books around as both monument, testament, and opportunity.
And also giving a lot of chances for people to encounter people across a wide spectrum and kind of in this ground where they can maybe start to see the complexity of each person or the privilege of the uniqueness.
Yeah, cool.
That's an amazing project. Well, and I guess the only other thing I wanted to shout you out for was writing that beautiful, I just wanted to mention House of Unending, which is such a beautiful title. And I was so impressed. It was the crown of sonnets. And how do you say guzzle at the beginning? Both of those structures kind of intertwine. And I feel that, I guess I just say to everyone watching today, please buy Dublin, read it. It's a book that will make you think and feel. Is there any?
That's high praise. I appreciate that.
And I really enjoyed talking to you. You can also go to the AWP. We've been partnering with bookshop.org, which is a nonprofit kind of They support independent bookstores. And I know you have a history with independent bookstores, so we all love independent bookstores.
Yeah.
And you can link to the AWP page and purchase Felon, and we'll be talking. And we're really excited to have had you talking to us. It's been really great.
No, it was my pleasure. This was real cool. Thanks, Sheila.
It was fun. Thanks. Take care.